Date, October 19th, 2018. Location, Central City. Rain pattered against the darkened windows of a quaint suburban home nestled in Redwood Glen, a neighborhood known for its stillness. It was this peace that had drawn Diana Lewis and her husband Malik to leave the bustle of the city. They had been married for 5 years, and with Diana working as a writer and Malik as an engineer, both craved the quiet Redwood Glen promised. But Diana's mother, Helen, wasn't thrilled about their choice. She'd always warned Diana of hidden dangers lurking in quiet towns. And now it seemed her instincts had been right. The welcome committee was limited. Neighbors waved but kept their distance. Diana sensed that something about her presence unsettled the residents, particularly one man, Lieutenant Frank Mitchell. He was a seasoned local officer who saw himself as the unspoken protector of Redwood Glen. And in his view, newcomers, especially outsiders like Diana, were an intrusion. Their initial exchanges were polite but laced with coldness. Frank's demeanor hinted at more than mere indifference. It was as though he viewed her as a stain on his well-kept community. But Diana, aware of his veiled resentment, held her head high. Her mother's words rang in her ears, a warning of what could happen when a person like Frank felt slighted. One sunny afternoon, Helen sat with Diana on the back porch, cautioning her daughter about trusting her neighbors too easily. But Diana had a plan. To her, this was a challenge. She wanted to break Frank's stony facade to prove that his prejudice wouldn't affect her. Diana set her plan into motion, greeting Frank with a warm smile each time they crossed paths. Though Frank initially brushed her off, she noticed his gaze linger. She began spending more time outside, casually walking by his house or jogging just when he returned from his shift, waving as she passed. The tension between them thickened like smoke, each interaction sparking an unspoken war. Frank's behavior soon shifted. His scowls softened, though his resistance was evident. Diana continued her subtle game, sensing a power she hadn't anticipated. When she leaned close, whispering sarcastic remarks about his sheriff-like presence in Redwood Glen, a flicker of emotion crossed his face, one he couldn't disguise. But while Diana toyed with Frank, another pair of eyes watched closely. Grace Mitchell, Frank's wife, who saw her husband's demeanor change. She noticed his distracted gazes, the silences growing between them. Frank dismissed it as work stress, but the more he tried to hide, the more she suspected. Late one evening, Frank worked in his garage, tinkering with his tools to stave off his restlessness. The quiet creak of footsteps pulled him out of his thoughts, and he looked up to see Diana, standing at the edge of his driveway, her eyes glinting in the dim light. "Need help with that, Lieutenant?" she teased, a smirk playing on her lips. She stepped closer, challenging the very boundary he'd tried so hard to maintain. Despite himself, Frank couldn't resist the thrill. What started as cold silence turned into whispered meetings, hushed conversations, and shared glances. Each encounter was a rush, a defiance against everything Frank had once stood for. For Diana, however, it was just a game. Her charm came easily, and as weeks passed, she began to tire of the charade. Yet Frank was entangled, obsessively drawn to her. Diana sensed it, the way he'd invent reasons to speak to her, the lingering looks. As Diana distanced herself, Frank's obsession morphed into a fixation. He began calling her at odd hours, trying to recreate their once thrilling encounters. She dodged him, keeping her interactions brief, her responses cold. Frank couldn't understand her sudden aloofness, and it only stoked his anger. In his mind, he convinced himself that Diana had used him and then discarded him. And while she thought he'd let it go, Frank's mind was a whirlwind of jealousy, resentment, and betrayal. Helen, noticing her daughter's anxiety, urged her to be cautious. Diana brushed off her concerns, but inside she knew her game had spiraled out of control. One evening, Malik arrived home to find a note pinned to their door with a hunting knife. It read, "This isn't over." Alarmed, he showed it to Diana, who brushed it off as a prank, though her heart pounded with fear. "Wait. If you support racism, comment 55. If you stand against it, comment 77. If you faced racism, let us know and share your story with us at our email in the channel description. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel." Malik sensed her discomfort and tried to bring it up, but she deflected, not wanting to involve him in her dangerous game. Helen, however, wasn't fooled. She urged Diana to report it, but Diana feared scandal and refused. Consumed by anger, Frank started plotting. He knew every step Diana took, every place she visited, and waited for the perfect moment. His mind was a dark maze of twisted rationales, each memory of her rejection igniting new levels of rage. Meanwhile, his erratic behavior didn't go unnoticed. Grace grew increasingly concerned. His behavior was slipping. The boundaries he once held so strongly had shattered. She could see it in the way his hands trembled when she mentioned Diana, or how he'd lash out when questioned. As Frank's obsession grew, another local officer, Deputy Marcus Lane, also began to notice his unsettling behavior. Marcus was a close friend of Malik's and had always admired Diana's strength. Sensing a storm brewing, he offered Malik subtle warnings, advising him to keep an eye on his family. One evening when Malik left for an overnight shift, Frank saw his opportunity. Diana, unaware, sat alone in her dimly lit living room when the door creaked open. Her stomach dropped. Standing in the doorway was Frank, an expression of dark triumph etched across his face. "Diana," he sneered, "did you really think you could just walk away?" Diana tried to maintain composure, her mind racing for a way out. She knew she couldn't overpower him, but she could outsmart him. She stalled, asking him questions, playing on his emotions to distract him, but his fixation ran too deep, and her attempts only seemed to provoke him further. In a burst of violence, Frank lashed out, his anger manifesting in a chilling act of brutality. By the time he left, the house was silent. Malik returned home to a scene of horror. The front door was slightly ajar, and silence filled the air. Inside, he found Diana's lifeless body, her once vibrant presence now a memory. Overwhelmed by grief and rage, Malik collapsed beside her, vowing to bring her killer to justice. As he pieced together the clues, he noticed Frank's wedding ring lying beside her body, a twisted token of guilt. With an aching heart, Malik realized the betrayal he'd never suspected. Enlisting Marcus, Malik set off on a relentless pursuit. Frank, now a fugitive, fled Redwood Glen. His paranoia became his constant companion, his once calm mind eroded by fear. Nights were sleepless, his conscience haunted by the echoes of his crime. Hiding in rundown motels, he'd look over his shoulder at every turn, imagining Malik's wrath closing in. With Marcus by his side, Malik's pursuit was fierce. They followed every lead, piecing together Frank's trail. The chase took them through small towns, desolate highways, each clue pulling them closer. In a remote desert town, Malik finally cornered Frank. They stood face to face under a starless sky, the air thick with years of anger, betrayal, and sorrow. Frank, desperate and broken, brandished a gun, his hands shaking. "Don't you get it?" Frank spat. "She wanted this. She brought it on herself." Malik's voice was ice cold. "You destroyed her. And for what? Because she saw through you?" In one swift movement, Malik disarmed Frank, and a brutal fight ensued. Each punch, each blow, was a catharsis for Malik, a release of the pain he'd carried. In the end, Malik held Frank down, his voice a whisper. "This is for Diana." The authorities found Frank's broken body in the desert, the justice Malik had taken into his own hands now an unspeakable secret. Redwood Glen, once a quiet sanctuary, would never forget the darkness it had concealed. Malik returned home, a man forever changed. As he stood by Diana's grave, he felt her spirit around him, urging him to let go of the vengeance that had nearly destroyed him. Sure to like this video, subscribe for more real stories, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps keep the fight for justice alive.